Hi, I'm Lori Brown. Welcome to Pondercast. Pondercast is completely supported by its listeners, people just like you, who give us a small monthly donation because they want to support this independent podcast. If you love the content, please consider supporting it by going to patreon.com/Pondercast. Okay, let's Pondercast. Have you ever come across the quiz that the New York Times ran? It was a list of 36 questions that lead to love that you're supposed to ask the person that you're falling in love with because they are designed to bring you a lot closer, a lot quicker. Questions like, do you have a secret hunch about how you'll die? Or, if you could change anything about the way you were raised, what would it be? This quiz really works. These are questions that get to the heart of things really quickly. Cut the chit-chat. Let's get a real conversation going. And there was one early question that really rocked my world. And that is, tell your life story in 2 minutes. To someone who knows very little about your past, what would you say? The point of the quiz is that you don't see the questions beforehand, so you have no time to fabricate a massaged answer to any of them. Well, I'm not going to give you any time either. Here's 2 minutes. Tell me your life story. And remember, you're telling it to someone that you are intimate with or want to be intimate with. This is not the stranger version. Okay, tell your story. Here's 2 minutes. Hard, right? But what was revealing to me is what I thought I needed to include and what didn't seem important in the crush of that 2-minute deadline. So this episode of Pondercast is about our stories. Is there anything more important about how we humans learn and grow, entertain each other, express ourselves, remember our history, imagine our futures, than our use of storytelling? The amazing people at the Moth podcast don't think so. They have been asking people to stand up on a stage and tell their true stories for 22 years now. Oh, they get more than 2 minutes. They get between 5 and 10 minutes to tell their story. The Moth organization has grown to be an international beast, helping people all over the world to stand up and speak their truth. The Moth's work is, I think, as much activism as it is storytelling. And they have one of the most successful podcasts going. You have to check it out if you haven't. They also have a radio hour on NPR. And when I spent some time in New York City, I lined up for one of their story slams in the Village. The lineup went around the block to get into the Housing Works Cafe that night. We were there to hear stories on the theme of camp. People who wanted to tell a story threw their name into a hat, and a small percentage of them got to get up and tell their stories. It was a great night. We drank beer and we listened. And then we went nuts clapping, and then we waited for the judges in the audience to rank their efforts. The top storyteller then goes on to the championship round. These storytellers don't read off notes, but they obviously had rehearsed what they wanted to say. And the participants who did it best, I think, are the ones who made the stories feel the most natural. They were hilarious stories, gruesome ones, serious, heartbreaking. I walked out of the place completely energized and feeling pretty great about the human race. There's always plenty of heart in a Moth evening. The next day I went to their office near Wall Street to talk to Sarah Austin Jennis, the executive producer of The Moth, about story and its hold on us, and why we need story more than ever right now. Sarah, how would you describe what The Moth is to someone who's never heard it?
Well, the Moth is an arts organization. It's 22 years old now, which is a little hard to believe. And it's all about true personal storytelling and the connection that is made when you tell a personal story that is meaningful in the trajectory of your life. Mm-hmm. So the shows that we have are very, very simple. They feature one storyteller standing on a stage in front of a single standing microphone, no bells and whistles, nothing behind them, no PowerPoint, and they have anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes to tell this personal story, depending on the series. The personal stories are true, they're first person, and they're usually about a decision you had to make or some kind of a turning point in your life. They're all about the agency that you had in this time. And they really allow us to spend a while walking in your shoes and seeing the world through your eyes, which I think is very special in this day and age.
Tell me about your job and your role here at The Moth.
Sure. I've been with The Moth for 15 years, coming up on 15 years, and I'm the executive producer. So I work with people one-on-one and helping them to shape their stories. I also am someone who, along with Sarah Haberman, started the Global Community Program, which is the series where we teach workshops in the Global South for people who want to use personal storytelling in their advocacy work in order to make real discernible change in the world. I am part of the team that selects the stories that move on to the podcast and the radio. I'm one of the radio hosts, so I wear a lot of different hats around here.
When I see the success of the podcast, what does that tell you about what's going on when you see The Moth is consistently up in the top 10 of podcasts?
Well, we don't take it for granted. It's very, very special. I remember when I first started at The Moth, some of our stories were on CDs, and we were thrilled when people bought the CDs because we were thinking, they're getting outside of, the individual rooms where they were told, how terrific is this? And so if 500 people heard the story outside of the room, it was a real cause for celebration for us. And then when the podcast started in 2008, actually before the Moth Radio Hour, it took off, and we were really blown away. The numbers are pretty high these days. I think it's about 60 million people a year who listen. We estimate, I love this number, we estimate that when a story is broadcast, that between the Moth podcast and the radio hour, a little bit over 2 million people, individual people, will hear it. Which is just incredible. It brings tears to my eyes because we're all about honoring the commonality and the diversity of the human experience. And to think that someone who perhaps doesn't consider themselves a storyteller or does and is known in their family and throughout their friend groups as a storyteller is being elevated and celebrated in this way is really special. And in this day and age, with all of our fake news and political turmoil and bombardment of upset and media of all sorts, I think more and more people I know more and more people are tuning in to listen to true personal stories. And the Moth stories are told, again, without any kind of additive. It's I wouldn't say it's necessarily raw because most people really think through where their story is going, but it is absolutely authentic. I say that these stories are like fingerprints. So why can only you tell the story? What are the details and what are the feelings associated with the experience that really let me as a listener feel close to you and understand why this event was important? And I think that idea of connection, whether you're in a public space listening en masse or in a large group to a storyteller on stage, or you're in your car or you're on your commute, people are tuning in because they want to feel more connected.
It's amazing to me, you talk about misinformation and fake news. It's amazing to me that when I hear a story on the Moth, my instincts in hearing that, I know this is a true story. And I don't get to use those instincts very often these days because I'm getting a lot of my information from social media. And it's actually quite comforting to find that those instincts still work, that I understand that this is truth by the way they're telling the story.
Well, I love hearing that, and I feel the same. I mean, we've all heard so many stories in our lives, and I think the number is now like 35,000 people who've told stories at the Moth over the years. But the authenticity is profound. And we always say that when you're telling a story, I can get into tips if you want at some point, but we say when you're telling a story that one of the most important things is to just be yourself. So I came from a theater background, always loved documentary film and had kind of a startup mentality when I was younger. And so I felt like the Moth was like the Venn diagram of all the things I was interested in. But one of the things I love about the Moth is that these are not people who are playing a role. You're not memorizing a monologue that someone else wrote. And believe me, I still love theater, but there's something just so tangible and immediate about this particular art form, where if you have memorized or if you are making things up, I feel like the audience knows. They can tell almost right away that there's just something not quite right.
And that is that's intuition, right?
Yeah. It's like your antenna, something goes off where you're thinking, hey, you're not telling me the full story. And sometimes directors really look for that with a storyteller. They say, I've been through that a few times working with people, will say, there's something over here that you're not quite saying, and I'm just reflecting back to you that it shows. So if you want to dive into that area, let's do it if you feel comfortable. But if not, let's restructure the framing a little bit because it's pretty obvious that there's a big chunk of this story that you're deliberately leaving out.
There are two things happening when there's a Moth Live event. What happens in the audience in listening to these stories?
I'm so happy that you brought that up because it looks like the Moth is about the storytellers, and it is, But consider one storyteller on stage, and some of our theaters hold up to 4,000 people. So you have 4,000 listeners to every one storyteller, and that's just in the theater. And then you have millions and millions of people who are listening to that one storyteller. And I think one of the reasons I have stayed with the Moth and have worked so hard with these teams of people who produce these shows is because we're really helping people to practice the art of listening. And that is something that is really, it's almost like prayer. I mean, I'm not very religious, but it's a shared experience, and listening is such a muscle that is underutilized these days. And so if we can have people just not interrupt for a few moments, just not to wait for that moment where they can interject with something even more fabulous or what they think is more interesting, I feel like we've done a good job. We also hear that there are family members and friends who will listen together in their cars or in their homes. And because of this shared listening experience, it then opens up all sorts of conversation that perhaps couldn't have been had if not for this listening experience.
Where right now everything seems so divided and polarized and rigid. People have extremely rigid opinions and points of view. What does hearing a true story, what potential is there for changing people's minds and breaking down some of those walls?
Well, we say that the Moth is a not-for-profit organization, but we say we're really in the business of empathy. And I think empathy is one of the tools that breaks down hate, right? I mean, we say as much of as personal and as specific as you can be to your own experience in this story, the more universal it becomes. And so I've always wondered if you get to know someone through the story that they're choosing to tell, but you don't front load it with some of these identity points ahead of time. It may come out in the story that there are, I don't know, that they're of a particular religion or in a certain socioeconomic status, or I don't know, any of these identity markers like have kids, don't have kids, have a degree, don't have a degree, live in this part of the world, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you're either moved by the story and feel connected or you're not. And so I feel like you get to know people who you might already know or who you might never have the chance to talk to. So who's the person on the bus sitting next to you and what is their story? And what about the person who you see every morning who's online with you for their coffee? What are they going through? And I like to think about this sometimes, but the Moth helps us to get inside of someone's mind and really figure out what their values are and what's important to them.
So that's one thing of what it does for the listener. What does it do for the storyteller to be able to get up on stage and tell their story?
Well, I've heard from many storytellers over the years that there's a real validation there in telling your story on the Moth stage or really any stage. A couple of people, many people who I've worked with or known to tell stories over the years have said to me, I didn't realize I even had a story to tell. Now, that's not everyone, because we also have lots of raconteurs who are really well known for telling stories and could spin a yarn almost out of anything. But there are some people who have said, I didn't think my story mattered. And then there are some people who have had a very, very particular story, either of immigration or escaping war, or and after telling it on a stage at the Moth, they are approached by either a handful of people or numerous people who have tears in their eyes and say, I had the same experience, or you remind me of my own grandmother, or my best friend's daughter went through that and no one knew how to talk to her about it, or have some sort of connection to the storyteller, so it just makes them feel a little bit less alone. I will tell you that a lot of people are very nervous to tell their stories. I mean, nerves are a part of it. I think nerves are really important. It shows that this is meaningful to you. The butterflies are a part of the process. But I can also say that if you're nervous to step on stage and tell your story, 10 times out of 10, you come off of the stage saying, when can I do that again? Or while I was up there, I thought of another one. So when can we chat about the next story? Which is really rewarding. I think everyone has multiple stories in this kind of format to share. There is another element to only the audio of a story or talk on podcast or radio, and that is there's no visual to distract you. I find that the visual can be so distracting because we add identity to a person based on what we're seeing. We can't help but do that. But in the timbre of someone's voice and the words that they're choosing to express themselves and the cadence, I feel like there's something that cannot be denied about their own personality and something that's ultimately affecting and connecting in a way that if you have the visual there too, it doesn't feel as strong.
If there was one story that you would present as something that is very meaningful to you that we might listen to on the podcast, what would that story be?
Oh, wow. Well, I have so many favorite stories over the years. Many of the stories come from our global program with Kenyan and South African and Ugandan storytellers. But I think one story that will always stand out to me is a story of Cynthia Riggs, from Cynthia Riggs. She called the pitch line. She was, I believe, 87 when she called. And the pitch, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was in her pitch, she said she had just received a box in the mail, a package in the mail, and the package didn't have a return address. It was just a longitude and a latitude.
Yikes.
And it was addressed to her, and when she opened it up, she found paper towels that were wrapped in archival plastic, and on the paper towels were cryptograms that had been written in pen a very long time ago. And on top of all of these pieces of paper towels in archival plastic was another cryptogram, a brand new cryptogram. And when she decoded it, it said, "Dear Cynthia, I've never stopped loving you, Howie." And therein became the beginning of this story where the big question was whether she was going to go out and find Howie, because he had only given her the longitude and the latitude. So he wanted to play the game.
He's playing hard to get.
Do you want to come find me or do you not, Cynthia Riggs? And it turns out that Cynthia had been divorced. She had had 3 children who were now adults and had their own families. And she was very happy to be living on Martha's Vineyard and be single. And she was a mystery writer. She had gone back for her MFA when she was 70 years old. So she had had all these lives already. And so she didn't know if she wanted to open herself back up to love or the possibility of love.
And that's the heart of the story.
And that's the heart of the story. And so I'm not going to give it away, but I would say take a listen to it, because the choices that she makes throughout, and also the reveal of some of her earlier heartache, no matter what age or what your background is, I find it very relatable. I also love that she called the pitch hotline, and she was in her late 80s. And, there's so many parts of that are so endearing to me. I love storytellers of all ages. I especially love storytellers who are in their 80s and 90s. They have so many stories to tell and so many stories that are so relatable for the younger generations. So hers is one that will always stick out to me. It was very, very special to hear that and to work with her on the story. And then to hear her tell it on Martha's Vineyard for one of the shows that we had. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. It was just a really very memorable night.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
So here's Sarah's favorite Moth segment for you. From its humble beginnings of a call to their story pitch line to the public performance that made its way to the Moth podcast.
So our next storyteller is Cynthia Riggs, and Cynthia answered our question, what are the 3 things you need to be prepared for a big night? With these 3 things, I need to take a shower, I need to bring my wallet, because given who I hang out with, I'll probably have to pay. And the third one is, I need to remember not to wear high heels in case I have to walk home. That's all very practical. Cynthia Riggs.
Well, I was born on Martha's Vineyard, and coming here tonight, I got lost. I had to ask someone where Union Chapel is. I come from a long line of vineyarders, and I'm descended from both the settling families, both the Atherns and the Mayhews. Well, I spent many years off island working as a boat captain, and then I returned to the vineyard, and I came to live with my mother, who lived in West Tisbury, Dionys Coffin Riggs, a poet. She and I opened a bed and breakfast catering to poets and writers, and that was kind of where I came from. After her death, when she was almost 99, I think some of you probably knew my mother. After her death, I was kind of at loose ends, and a bed and breakfast guest suggested that I go back to school and get a degree in creative writing. So I filled out an application form, and they accepted me, and somebody told me I ought to write murder mysteries. And 2 years later, my first murder mystery was published by St. Martin's Press. I've now had 10 published, and the 11th, I think, is on Kindle, and I'm working on the 12th right now. Well, my first book was published when I was 70. I love this audience. There's hope for all of you. Well, about 6 months ago, a mystery came into my life that was something that was totally unexpected. I had thought about a guy that I'd met many years before. His name just sort of popped into my mind. And so I looked him up on Google, and I couldn't find him, so I sort of forgot about it. Well, 2 weeks later, I got a package from him. Now, it was his name, and when I Googled it, I'd spelled it wrong. But the return address was a latitude and longitude. I opened the package, and inside was an archival envelope that had a whole bunch of old, dried up, yellowed paper towels in it. And the paper towels were all covered with scrawled out cryptograms. Also in this package, there was a little note, also with a more modern cryptogram. Well, I had no idea what this was all about. So I looked at some of the messages on these paper towels, and it all came back to me. When I was 18 years old, I was marine geology major at a college in Ohio, of course. My college managed to find me a college job lasting for 4 months in San Diego, working for Scripps Oceanographic Institution, sorting plankton at as a research project. Now, I was just thrilled. I'd never been out west before. I was working in a real laboratory. I was 18, and most 18-year-olds are clueless. I was particularly clueless. Now, my co-workers were a bunch of guys who had been working sorting plankton for much too long. They were bored. And if you could imagine it, they were rather bright, so they came up with some wonderful practical jokes, I guess you can call it, like nailing my lab drawers shut. And I had no idea how to handle this. All these little practical jokes that were playing, or talking in codes that I didn't understand. But there was one guy in the lab. He was an elderly man. He was 28. He started defending me against my tormentors. So I started, my dad had been in the Army, and he'd introduced me to cryptograms. So I just loved the idea of these secret messages. So I wrote these secret messages as cryptograms to Howie on these paper towels. Now, he kept them for 62 years. Well, I have a group of young women in my Wednesday writers group, and I said to them, "What do you think of all this?" And they said, they're all young women, they all said, "You've got to get in touch with this guy. You just have to. This is wonderful." And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, how am I going to get in touch with him? This was latitude and longitude. So I Googled it. I found that there was sort of a circle right around Baja California, the coast. Now, I knew that Howie had a dental degree, so that was kind of a clue. I figured, okay, there was a golf resort somewhere within that latitude and longitude. So I called this golf resort on their toll-free number, and I said, "Was there a Dr. A registered there?" No, there wasn't. Then I figured, okay, that circle could include the coast of Baja California. So I figured, aha, he's on a cruise ship. So I found a cruise ship tracking site on Google. This is all true. There were no cruise ships in the area at that time. So then I was sure I had it. He had a private yacht. He was a retired dentist after all. By the way, I'm sort of diverting from this, but I happen to be writing a book called Blood Root, which is based on murder in a dentist's office. I figured the captain had come up to Dr. A and said, "Dr. A, sir, this is your latitude and longitude." But that was kind of a dead end. The next thing I figured, okay, I'll go to the California Dental Association. And I found him. I found him and I found the address. Now, he'd been a public health dentist for one of the counties in California, which sort of shot the idea of the yacht. So I went back to my Wednesday writers. I have a representative group of Wednesday writers here, and I said, "Now what?" And they said, "You've got to get in touch with this guy. You just have to." Well, I figured I could write him maybe a sort of a non-committal note. So I did that, and I said, Well, I just got that packet that you sent, and I decoded the message, and that was it. No. Now, the Wednesday writers, in the meantime, had formed sort of a cheering section, and it was going something like this. This is every woman's fantasy. This man has spent a lifetime loving you and searching for you. Now, you need to know a little something about my background. I wasn't totally off on men, but I was a little uncomfortable because I'd been married for 25 years to a very brilliant but a very abusive husband, and married him after we were divorced for 35 years. He stalked me for 20. So I was not comfortable opening any doors to any kind of intimacy, and these paper towels. The things that lead to intimacy. Well, I sent this letter off to what might or might not have been a current address, and by golly, I got a letter back, or it was a postcard back, and it said, nicer than nicer, nicer than nice to hear from you. So I knew I had the address right. The next thing I did was to send him a book of poetry I had a daughter who died about 5 years ago, and this was a book of her poetry, and I sent it to him, and he wrote back and he said, I had a son who died the same time your daughter died, about the same age. And as you can imagine, this broke down a lot of barriers in a hurry. If you think of the worst thing that can happen to parents is to have a child die and to have two of us sort of sharing this painful experience. So we started corresponding. And we started having kind of finding out these coincidences that happened. It wasn't just the me writing the blood route, and it wasn't just the kids' deaths, but it was the manganese nodules. Yeah. Now, since I'm speaking to a group that is near the oceanographic, probably many of you know what manganese nodules are, but most people don't. They're sort of knobby little lumps of black-gray looking mineral deposits that are found only in the deep sea. A few museums have these manganese nodules, and very, very few individuals have manganese nodules. And Howie happened to have one that came from the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, and he sent it to me. Well, I just happened to have been on an Antarctic research cruise. I had a small sack full of manganese nodules. I sent him 4. I made sure they were smaller than his. The next thing Howie sent me, by the way, at this time, the young woman in the West Chisbury post office got involved in this romance. She would say, as she gave me a package, another letter from your boyfriend. The next thing he sent me was a CD of a piece of music that his son had composed called Cactus on Mars. Well, my son-in-law, who's a geophysicist, was evaluating research proposals for Mars. This has been going on and on and on. Now, at this point, the Wednesday writers stepped in again and said, you have to go see this guy. I had no intention of going to see him, but you have no idea what these women are like. You can talk to two of them afterwards. They're representative. So I have a ticket to California on my desk. Now, Howie found out that I'm an avid gardener, so he sent me 7 seed packages. Now, one was hollyhocks, H for Howie, and one was catnip, C for Cynthia. And in between, he had leeks, okra, vinca, eggplant, and spinach. Well, this is a real romance. So I'm going out to see him, but now here comes the question. When I appear, is he going to have in his mind this 18-year-old that he fell in love with? I mean, I'm 81 now, and he's 90. And I asked the Wednesday writers, well, what can you do? And they said, oh, plenty. One of the things that Howie has meant to me, he's actually changed my life. I had been pretty much closed up. But what he did was he gave me some very gentle warmth. He also introduced me to a kind of a calm love that I'd never thought of before. He also introduced me to kind of a sweet passion. You'd be surprised at what you can do in letters. And codes. But most of all, the thing that's really, really affected me a lot is he gave me back a sense of great self-worth. And with that, I hope you all can find a Howie or his equivalent.
Cynthia Briggs. Cynthia Briggs, ladies and gentlemen.
A classic story from the Moth podcast. Sometimes our true stories can take a lifetime before they can be told. How many things have happened to you that you still struggle with? To untangle all the emotions involved, to understand why something happened and your role in it all. It can take a lifetime for the ripple effect from an event to play out, and the story keeps changing. Lots of things can stop us from telling our most life-changing stories. Shame, fear, confusion, regret, or our own never-relenting inner voice that tells us, no one wants to hear that. Oy. You have a true story to tell. Maybe you haven't quite figured out how to tell it yet. Take a crack at it now. What is the story that you would tell? Tell me the 2-minute version. Take a shot. Because the world needs your story. You've done it. Thanks to Sarah for the interview and Meryl Cooper for setting it up, and thanks to the Moth for letting us play Cynthia's story. I'm Lori Brown. Thanks for listening to Pondercast.